Dear Bob, thank you so much for your time and availability in talking with me.
Good morning. Good morning. Nice to meet you again.
During our last meeting, I thoroughly appreciate our exchange about Freemasonry. Allow me to begin this conversation with a very simple question. How is your Masonic journey begun?
Slightly unusually, I suppose. It's not a typical. It was not a typical beginning. Uh, it really was all about history, because unlike a lot of people, I'm the first Freemason in my family that I know of, anyway. But I was very curious. I was very curious about the history that I heard Freemasons talking about. So I thought I would become a Freemason to learn more, basically. Yeah, simple as that.
Fantastic. And then through this period, you walk your path across the rankings, and today you are the curator of the Masonic Museum in Scotland. What
Sure.
does a curator of a Masonic museum do?
Well, in my case, I suppose I'm again a bit different from most curators because I've actually got a range of duties. So, although I look after the museum, that's a small museum, but very interesting nonetheless. But also, as well as the museum, I look after the archives, which is essentially the paperwork, the records of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and the other duty, the other main duty, is to look after the library, which of course is a collection of books. So I have three functions under the title curator: the museum, the archives, and the library. So that keeps me busy, that's for sure.
On a personal level, what has how has the experience of being a curator, so looking at archives, looking at historical documents, and being an author of books, changed or evolved your passion for Freemasonry?
I suppose the most important thing for me is that in many ways I've been forced to learn. And this is because we receive inquiries from all over the world. And in order to answer those inquiries, I usually have to do a little bit of research, a little bit of reading. So perhaps on subjects that I wouldn't personally choose, but to answer these queries, I do a lot of reading. And so I learn whether I actually want to or not. And so, in that sense, it's made me go down a route that perhaps a lot of people would not have chosen. So my understanding of Freemasonry is extremely wide. So it's not based just from what I know at lodge level. It is a truly sort of international dimension. Uh, Add to that I have been invited to give presentations in numerous parts of the world over the years. So I've had the opportunity to travel. So I've met lots and lots of people over the years. And the other thing about Freemasonry is that the ordinary Freemason, I suppose, he moves a lot in the sense that he will go through the degrees, he will join other orders, and he will move in that sense. He will physically move and he will move through time. I've been fixed, if you like, in the one place for 28 years now. And so I've seen how Freemasonry moves through time. And that is very interesting to see how people change, how people develop, and at the same time, how Freemasonry as an organization, not just a kind of national level in Scotland, but also at an international level, it also moves. But nobody, I think, actually sits and looks at the institution, in this case of Freemasonry, and sees how it as an organization moves through time. So that's given me a perspective that I think very few people have. And that's just fortunate because I'm in this position. Um, so it's unusual, but it gives me a perspective I think that not that many people have. But I enjoy it. That's the main thing.
Exactly. Bob, Erasmus published a book entitled Collecteana Dagiorum in 1500. In this book started with a proverb: "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Believe it or not, I grew up being told this proverb, and with time and experience, I had courage to add a second part to it. And in my opinion, in the same land, that man, that king, would be considered crazy and most likely dangerous. I mean, I can even think he will be probably arrested, imprisoned, vilified, and so on. How can Freemasonry teaching rise above this cacophony of information spread by social media and be enrich those people that are seeking a path for perfection, and not just be a conspiracy theory used by movie makers for movies?
Yeah, that's it is a very sad consequence, I think, of the sort of internet age. Um, but that's where we are. How we can survive in the land of the blind? Um, I don't know. Erasmus came up with lots of lovely proverbs. He uses the analogy of the blind quite a lot. He also came up with the blind leading the blind as another proverb. So I'm not suggesting that that's what we're doing at the moment, but I think in to a large extent, our problem is that we, as individuals, as individual Freemasons, we seem to think that we have to become involved in the internet age with a dialogue across the world, um, um, giving our point of view. Now, I can understand the desire for that, but to a large extent, a lot of the people that we are trying to convince that we are good people and that we're not, we don't have horns and all that kind of stuff. We're trying to explain to people that that's not the case. Our problem is that a lot of these people don't want to be convinced of that. They are really not interested in what we've got to say. So, in some ways, certainly with some people, we're completely wasting our time. They don't want to hear what we've got to say. They've made up their own minds as to what we stand for, and nothing will convince them otherwise. In fact, participating in a kind of discussion with people like that, we're actually probably adding fuel to the fire because we're almost encouraging them to repeat and emphasize their point of view. So I suppose what I'm getting at is I don't think there's any group of us Freemasons who have ever sat down and evaluated whether it's worth our while in spending time involved in these discussions. The other point of view, and it's the one that I favour, is that because we do what we do in private, behind closed doors, why are we getting involved in the cacophony, as you call it, of the internet age? Why are we even bothered? Freemasonry is a physical, and it's in a particular location. And so, for that reason, Freemasonry cannot exist as Freemasonry in an internet dimension. it cannot. We can talk about it just as we are today, and that's very useful, I think, for an educational point of view. But this is not Freemasonry. You and I talking is not Freemasonry. Freemasonry are lodge meetings, etc., etc. So until anyone until they become a Freemason, they cannot understand and never will understand what it is we are talking about. So I suspect that we are, although some people find it interesting and entertaining to become involved in these kind of internet discussions, um, I'm, I think everyone has to decide for themselves whether it's worth their while. But as far as Freemasonry goes, I don't think it serves any particular purpose. In that case, that means that we are stepping to one side, and that's what we've got to offer. We don't offer anything on the internet. What we offer takes place in a lodge. So if anyone is interested, that's where they have to go to understand what we're about. They cannot understand, certainly nowhere near fully, they cannot understand from listening to a conversation like this. To
Right.
understand, they have to become a Freemason. And we cannot do that over the internet.
Bob, as we have been discussing over the last month, this summer I had the pleasure of reading a number of your books, and like I told you, your writing style is very structured, and from my point of view, requires a lot of effort from your side in order to build such book. In fact, you don't present me with an opinion or one information. You actually build a whole context around the subject that you're addressing. You give me the historical, political, religious, you point me to local powers, cultural, and so on. So all element around the topic that you're presenting me with. Therefore, you offer me the opportunity, me and the reader, you offer that opportunity not just to take for granted what you're presenting me with, but enrich that information with the context in order to make sense out of that particular event. So writing a book, however, is a monodirectional experience. You study, you research, you find information, you write the book, and then the book is given to the reader, and it's up to the reader then to reach conclusions. So, out of curiosity, what has been the most surprising response that you receive about your books, the Rosalind Ox, for example, and the one response that actually disappointed you the most?
It's an interesting question. First and foremost, on the subject of writing a book, uh, I think part of the difficulty I have always had is that I think Freemasonry is very inward looking. And that's given what we're talking about with these attacks, conspiracy theories, or religious attacks, or political attacks. It's no wonder that we turn inwards. And because we turn inwards and we're navel gazing in many ways, that means we don't look at the wider world. And so when we think about Freemasonry, we think about it in isolation, and I don't think that's a good idea. It's not good for the organization because there is a world out there, whether we like it or not. It goes on, and so we have to take in when I do write, I have to take into account the world in which we live. But of course, most of my writing is historical, so we've got to take into account the world as it was when these events were taking place. So that's why the books are written in that way. They tend, I hope anyway, they bring in other subjects that are relevant to the point I'm trying to make. In terms of, let me tell you the most disappointing comment that I've had first, and that is And I'm not going to tell you who or where,
No,
but
exactly.
a Grand Master once asked me, well, Bob, you're a Masonic author, you've written lots of books. If I really, really had to read one book about Freemasonry, which one would it be? And I was kind of gobsmacked because, frankly, if I was a Grand Master, I would want to read all the books I could about Freemasonry, not just sort of limit myself to one. But that was the question that was asked, and that was kind of disappointing. Um, if I was going to be really, really nasty, I would have said, well, there's only one book to read, and that's Morals and Dogma, and
Albert Pike.
by Albert Pike, and that would have probably that would have kept him going for the rest of his days.
Yeah.
But anyway, there we go. The most the nicest thing, I suppose, that's happened is that I don't know. There's been so many. It seems unfair to pick on one. Um, I got a phone call from the publisher of one of the books saying, your book got to #1 on Amazon today.
Wow.
Which I thought that was that was kind of cool, wasn't it? #1 on Amazon. What he didn't tell me was it was on Amazon at #1 for 5 minutes on one day. So when I found that out, that kind of that
It
kind of
just deflated itself.
that's right, kind of deflated me. But that was a kind of nice thing to do, to phone me and tell me that. Even although he didn't tell me the whole story, if you like.
I hope you took a screenshot of the moment, those 5 minutes.
Yeah, I never thought about that at the time, but that was so. Yeah, so but it's nice that other people were thinking enough of me to actually let me know. So
Yeah, very true. Bob, we live in a particular time, 1.5 year plus of a pandemic that literally has changed a lot of people's life in society. But for Freemasonry, for the first time ever in our history, we had to suspend our ceremonies, our meetings, and we are not yet there. There are still limitations about the number of brethren that can participate. Is this a moment in Freemasonry history of change? And is COVID-19 pointing at a danger for Freemasonry in the future?
yes, one thing that I've learned, and of course this applies to most historians, I think, is when we look at the past, quite often we're looking for patterns, and patterns in the past sometimes can be used to predict what may or may not happen in the future. But it's one of the ways that history can be used. So when we look at things in the past, whether it's papal bulls against Freemasonry, or the schism that created the ancients versus the moderns, Grand Lodge, or the appearance of irregular Freemasonry, etc., or the Holocaust and the persecution of Freemasons, there have been very dramatic instances in the past that have affected Freemasonry. But out of all those examples, quite a few of them are caused by outside external forces, and some are internal. And so these patterns we can see have two origins, if you like, our own self-inflicted wounds and those that are created outside our own control. And so applying that to the future, today's pandemic clearly has an effect that we can't quite see how it's going to affect Freemasonry. But when we look at things like wars, or perhaps even another similar thing, Spanish flu in 1918, 1919,
Yeah.
that killed millions across Europe. And of course, a lot of them would be Freemasons as well. And it's kind of odd, as a historian, you think such a huge event, like a war, say the Second World War, when you read some lodge minutes, from 1939 to 1945, as I have been doing recently, you think there was no war at all, because they never mention it.
Wow.
There is no mention of this huge, it's a world war. And in fact, in one of the lodges records that I was reading, the only mention of the World War was the government had taken over the lodge as a training room for soldiers, and they were complaining in the minutes that the government had damaged some of the lodge furniture. They were trying to work out how to get the money to repair the furniture, And so it was almost as if, and again, I think that's an example of Freemasonry looking internal.
Inwards, like you were saying.
And as if the war had no effect on them. And it perhaps comes along a little bit later, to be fair to the lodge. A few years after the war, they prepared the roll of the people who had been killed and the roll of the people who had served.
Yeah.
But it was after the event, which, if you're writing a diary, a personal diary, but you would never mention the fact that there was a war, you just wouldn't do it, would you? So,
correct.
In some ways, these events, they take place, but sometimes we as Freemasons don't seem to think that they affect us. And of course they do. So let me sort of answer your question. Sorry, that was a little bit of a ramble, but the effect of COVID, I think, we can see it will have multiple effects. It won't just have one. The first one will be that we, in the last 18 months, 2 years, a lot of our older brethren will have died. That's inevitable. So we will have lost them during this pandemic. That raises two questions. Will lodges, especially smaller lodges, will they survive if they have lost a lot of their older members? And then as an organization, what are we doing to remember them? Because if somebody dies when when times are normal, it's recorded in the minutes that brother so-and-so passed away, and we'll have some kind of way of marking their passing.
Yeah.
But because there is no meeting, how are we going to mark the fact that these brethren have passed to the Grand Lodge above? Because there's no record.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to encourage everyone that when they return to normal, they should be listing all those who have passed away during the pandemic, not just because of COVID, but for all reasons, so that at least they're remembered that they passed away. The other thing that is probably going to have an effect is that people have found other ways to use their time. So they can't go to the lodge meetings, so they now have a bit of spare time, and they're using it for other things. Now, whether that's simply watching television or looking after the grandchildren or whatever, their routine has changed. And so, the third Tuesday of every month is now taken up with something else. Will they come back to the lodge now that they've found something else to do? And that's going to be a bit of a problem, I think, for some lodges. So perhaps they should be now making preparations to try and get all these guys to come back. So while we have a kind of a little bit of breathing space, and I suppose it's different in every country, but in Scotland, it looks like we'll probably not be back to full normality until January
Next year. Yeah.
next year. In which case we have a few months in order to try and generate or regenerate the interest in lodge activity, and try and ensure that most of the brethren are going to come back when things are normal. So we should be making plans now as to how to do that. Now, whether that is simply making sure that the lodge or the secretary, who usually does all the donkey work, the lodge secretary starts phoning all the brethren, to make sure that they know what the plans are for the future, and start making contact with everyone to make sure they know. And I know that there's quite a few lodges here. What they're going to do for the first meeting is it's going to be quite informal. People will have forgotten to do things. Certain things that we do, they will have forgotten. They will have forgotten certain words and things like that. And a lot of people won't come back to the lodge because they're embarrassed, because they've forgotten. So a lot of lodges here are going to be having meetings where it's a kind of re-education program, where there's no embarrassment. It's all very informal. Anybody can ask questions. I can't remember what we do, or how do you do this? How do you do that? And so all this stuff is explained without any pressure. So that's the kind of immediate problem, I think, that COVID has given us. Whether or not we can overcome that, I think, will depend on the lodge. Some lodges are very strong, some are weak. The other thing that is worth mentioning, I think, and that's exactly what we're doing just now, I suppose, in a sense, is that COVID's given us an opportunity, and it's been a great opportunity, and it's oddly enough, unlike most Freemasons, it's been taken up with huge enthusiasm, and that is using things like Zoom for educational purposes. So what's kind of obvious to me is what's happened is people have said, well, I can't go to the lodge meeting because it's closed, the lodges are closed, but I still like to learn more about Freemasonry. And so Zoom meetings have given us the opportunity to discuss what Freemasonry is, its history, its ethos, its morality, and dare I say it, even its spirituality, all that kind of stuff. And most of the discussions that have taken place about Freemasonry across the world have involved discussions that would never take place at a lodge meeting. And that's because a lodge meeting is very structured. We all have, there is a process we go through at a lodge meeting. There's an opening, there's minutes, etc., etc., etc. And when the lodge closes, then there seems to be no real quality time, if you like, in which to discuss more serious or more in-depth understanding of Freemasonry. Zoom has allowed us to do that. So the question is, do we continue something that we have discovered during COVID, that is Zoom, and continue with that at the same time as going back to normal with our lodge meetings? And that's going to be very interesting to watch what happens from about now for the next couple of years. And I'll be interested to see if that gives us a new way of looking at Freemasonry, a new way of discussing Freemasonry.
Yeah, I agree with you. So basically the offer of what traditional Freemasonry does in the lodge will not be replaced, because video calling can be used as an addition, is addressed properly.
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's right. And I do know of one lodge that what they are now doing is they have bought a huge TV, and they've mounted it on the wall of the lodge. And every second meeting, they invite a speaker to give a Zoom presentation in the lodge.
Wow.
Because there's such a thirst for knowledge about Freemasonry. So they don't want to lose this newly discovered means of education. And so they've integrated it into their actual lodge meetings.
Wow.
So that'll be interesting to watch as well.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, I'm sure that there are more lodges or more brethren that are more tech savvy and open for integration and exploring this part. It's a very interesting point. Thanks.
Well, that's right. I mean, let me give you very quickly,
Please.
As a historian, I'm always looking at examples, but when telephones were being installed in people's houses, and obviously this kind of gives away my age a bit, I suppose, but when telephones were being installed, it was going to be the end of Freemasonry, because you would be able to speak to people miles and miles away, and there would be no need to go to the lodge to speak to brother so-and-so. And, so the telephone was going to be the death knell of all sorts of things. And of course, as we know, it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. That's a nice story. I didn't know this one, Bob. Thanks.